at the VMFA.
Great. All right. I'm going to hit that one and let's see if we have the gods of technology with us tonight. Can you all?
It was working.
All right.
Yeah.
So hello, everybody. And thank you for inviting me to speak with you tonight. I started my job at the VMFA a little more than a year ago, and I'm the first photography curator officially, but I'm actually really benefiting from more than 90 years of photography collecting, maybe 80 years, almost 90 at the museum. And one of the first things I did when I got to the museum was to start understanding the role that photography has played in the formation of the museum, but also kind of why I'm the first curator, because it is a little bit late in the game. So what I'm gonna talk about tonight is sort of like the stop and start history of photography at the museum, and sort of how we got to where we are now, and then a little bit about my vision for the future. So I'm gonna start right now at the beginning. In a cold January evening in 1936, I would like to say it was exactly January 11th, but it was January 16th, 1936. And this was in the midst of the Great Depression. The VMFA opened its doors to a curious public. Now, the first exhibition at the museum, which was curated by Thomas Colt, who was the museum's first director and curator, was kind of, one-stop shopping. It was an exhibition that surveyed the major trends in American painting at the time, really from sort of, the colonial period through 1910. And it featured about 150 paintings borrowed from local collectors, from other museums. And it was the kind of show that you would expect. It was bold and ambitious, but also that you might expect for a new public-private museum in Virginia, one of the great centers of American history, of course. However, within 3 months of that museum opening, the institution then mounted not one, but two photography exhibitions. And this was what was really astounding to me, that photography was part of the museum almost from the first moments, and yet it still took till 2021 to actually formally establish a department for photography. So the first exhibition, actually I'm going to go back, was an exhibition of the Richmond Camera Club, the Camera Club of Richmond, of which you are all a part, which had just been founded a few years earlier in 1931. Well, I've read 1931 and 1932. Maybe you actually have the bylaws and know when it was officially founded. I think it was called the Amateur Photo Club at the time. But it was the brainchild of two men, William Edward Booth and J. Hayden Hankins. And the club was invited to show at the museum. And a deal was struck with Thomas Colt that the medal winners of the exhibition of the Camera Club every year would be added to the museum's permanent collection. So in that first year, in 1936, 5 photographs were added to the permanent collection. And one of them is what you see on the screen by Ray Selden. And this was actually very interesting to me because, first of all, now I know really the earliest years of the museum's photography collection is absolutely due to the Camera Club of Richmond, and more broadly to the Virginia Photographic Society. I'll talk about that in a minute. But also I was really surprised because the first work was in color in 1936. And of course, this is the very beginning of color being kind of commercially available, but it was definitely not really used very much for what we might call art photography at the time. But Selden actually was an interesting character. I'm going to show you this screen now. And I apologize for the Getty images, but I was not going to pay to have that unwatermarked. He actually founded a photography studio in Richmond, and made a lot of portraits, including, you know, a visiting, this is the Tuskegee Airman who was visiting through Richmond, as well as color photo postcards. So, you know, you can imagine his early facility for color really suited him exceptionally well for this kind of work. And then 3 of the other 5 works that entered that year were actually by Edwin Booth himself. Of course, he was the main founder of the Camera Club. Now, he was a really interesting character. The kind of way that the history of photography is written, there's been this divide between camera club amateurs and commercial photographers, and then this rarefied art photography kind of realm. And, you know, I think a lot of work needs to be done on the role of these camera clubs throughout the United States. Because I think once you begin to really look at it, you realize that actually it's a much more complicated history. Booth himself was actually a professional photographer. He was a staff photographer for the Times-Dispatch for many years. So he had this tremendous technical facility. He also had access to, you know, darkroom and professional materials. But he also had this other interest, which was really promoting photography as a fine art. And I think you can kind of see that in this picture, which is not a documentary picture in the sense of the Dorothea Lange or Walker Evans, although not very different, it's the same time period, but kind of a narrative picture that is clearly staged. And I should add too that the central character here is fascinating. The old woman is named Sarah Ann Carroll, and she was somebody that Booth photographed frequently, and he wrote about her. And she had actually been born as an enslaved individual. So here she was in 1936, kind of one of the remaining figures of antebellum South. And so here she is kind of talking to the youngest generation. And it's a story about sort of passing down, you know, lived experience and wisdom. She actually ended up being a midwife and worked for many years along with a doctor in Crozier, Virginia. And evidently, when she died, probably in the 30s, she was either 109 or 116 years old. Now, today, we might look at this picture and kind of see it as maybe a little bit cloyingly sweet, you know, but at the time, I think we can really appreciate that this was a self-consciously artistic, composed scene that also had a kind of social narrative to it. I mean, this is also being presented in segregated Virginia in the 1930s. And it met the standards of the Camera Club members, which was a highly aesthetic vision. Now, just kind of more briefly, I'll stay on this picture. The Camera Club of Richmond, which was started in either 1931 or 1932, was really part of a much broader network of camera clubs that were established throughout the United States, beginning in the late 19th century. And the sort of peak moment of camera clubs throughout the country was from, you know, the turn of the century through the 1950s. And the umbrella organization for this was the Photographic Society of America. So that was that's the sort of uber camera club. But throughout the United States, you have all of these other camera clubs. And the members of these clubs varied from, you know, professionals like Edwin Booth, who also had a sort of 2 careers, one as a journalist and one as an artist. And then you had the so-called amateurs, which is not somebody who's untrained so much as somebody who is making photographs for a non-commercial purpose. And then, you know, you had this partnership within Virginia, which was particularly interesting between the Camera Club and the museum. And in fact, this continued starting in 1937. The museum hosted the annual Virginia Photographic Salon. So it was no longer just the Richmond Camera Club, but it was the sort of photographic salon of Richmond. You had people applying and sending in work from all over the country. And you had a jury that was involved, a couple of different people, including the director of the museum, Thomas Colt. I'm showing you this. This is the first catalog of the Virginia Photographic Salon, 1937. And the preface in it actually talks about the importance of photography at this moment. And, you know, it noted that this was the boom days for photography, and that, and I'm going to read you this quote, "At present time, Virginia is experiencing what might be termed a photographic renaissance." And it goes on to note the formation of no fewer than 4 different camera clubs, and talks about different Virginia photographers who are achieving national renown. So this was all really interesting to me, and it actually got me looking into different camera clubs in Richmond. I was surprised and thrilled to discover that, in fact, one of the earliest ones was founded in Hampton as a part of what is now Hampton University, but at the time was the Hampton Normal School, later became Hampton Institute. And this was the essentially college university school founded in 1868 at the end of the Civil War, sort of during the prime period of Reconstruction, for the education of formerly enslaved individuals. It expanded its reach for both Black Americans and Native Americans. And the Camera Club was founded so in 1893. It was led predominantly by white photographers, but not exclusively. Its membership was not segregated. There were at least 12 Black members that we know of, and also women. And what I'm showing you here are 2 cyanotypes from an album made by Emily Herron. We don't know a whole lot about her, but we do know that she was an early member of the Camera Club at Hampton. And this beautiful album, which is unfortunately at the Chrysler, not at the VMFA, shows sort of daily life in and around Hampton. And I thought it was interesting too that she was using cyanotype process, but you know, one of the reasons for the explosion of camera clubs at this time, you know, after about 1890, was the evolution of different photographic technologies. So George Eastman comes out with the first snapshot camera in 1888. You know, you press the button, we do the rest. And it was the first camera where you could send the film in and it would be developed for you and you send the prints back. But there were lots of other kind of developments. And of course, the cyanotype was one of the easiest forms of photography to produce. I mean, you had to make a negative in these cases, but then you didn't have to use a darkroom. You could just take your negative and you could put your pre-made cyanotype paper, you get it wet, you put it out in the sun with a negative and you can print it in the sun. So, you know, the technological developments really opened up photography to a lot of people who, you know, otherwise might not have had the funds or the training or the access to the medium in the 1860s and 70s. So anyway, Hampton Club photography is founded in 1893, Richmond 1931 or 32. But the partnership between the VMFA and the Camera Club world kind of grew over the next decade. So the museum hosted every year the Virginia Photographic Salon. There was a jury every year. The director of the museum was on the jury, and the prize winners every year came into the museum's collection. So that meant that the very first set of acquisitions for the museum really are formed by either members of camera clubs or people who applied to get into these salons. Now, more broadly, as I mentioned, this is a boom time kind of for camera clubs. It's also the rise of different kinds of photographic education throughout the United States. So one of the most, sort of famous schools is Clarence White School, but you also had Alfred Stieglitz kind of promoting photography as a fine art. And as a result, this is also the moment where the first museums begin to collect photography seriously. The Boston Museum of Fine Arts is probably one of the first. They started their photography collection in 1928. Museum of Modern Art, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art all began collecting photography in the 1930s. So in that sense, we can say that Virginia was sort of on the cutting edge, right? 1936, first, in fact, the second work that came into the collection was that color photograph I showed you. The first work, we don't know what it is. The work has gone missing and I haven't been able to find a record of it. So we can sort of say the very first work was a color photograph. Now, that being said, not all of the work that came into the museum at those times was cutting edge. This was not, the sort of Alfred Stieglitz modernist photography. You see here sort of two works that came in 1937, that first year that the Virginia Photographic Salon, and they are, technically complete, but I wouldn't say that they're among the most sort of, cutting edge in terms of subject matter or approach. There were some very good photographers, very ambitious. Frank Nofzinger is one of them. He was a regular exhibitor at the annual salon. And you can see here from this kind of texture study that he had sort of ambitions to being, aesthetically driven, thoughtful photographer. But it would be hard pressed for me to say that, Virginia and not New York was the center of photography, or San Francisco. And those were the kind of the two poles at the moment. You had the schools around, Stieglitz on the one hand, on the right coast, and on the left coast, you had Imogen Cunningham and Weston and others. But I think you can see that, this idea that there was only those schools and nothing else happening anywhere else in the country, we can put some pressure on that narrative. Now, I mentioned that there were two exhibits in the first year of photography, first year of the museum's existence. And the second one is a little more unusual. And that is a solo exhibition by Francis Benjamin Johnston. And in fact, the museum has 159 works by Johnston that came in 1936 because of this. And I was really thrilled to discover that we had this core collection and that it had been in for so long. One of the things that I was thrilled about is that Johnston herself is an incredible figure in the history of photography and really in kind of the history of American culture. So just that's her self-portrait on the left. I'm going to talk about it in a minute. So one of the things about Johnston, she was born in 1864 in West Virginia. So just like right before the end of the Civil War. And I guess right after West Virginia split from Virginia over the issue of slavery. And she was and she grew up in DC, educated parents, and she learned photography early on as a corollary to journalism. Her mother actually was a journalist. And then she began to make photography her kind of main business. And she had a portrait studio in DC where she photographed kind of Washington luminaries. But she expanded beyond that pretty quickly. She was known as a photojournalist, but she also did a documentary project actually at Hampton. Along with W.E.B. Du Bois, she produced all these photographs about sort of Black education at Hampton that were shown at the 1900 World's Fair in Paris. She also organized an exhibition of women photographers in Paris in 1900. So, 120 something years ago. She was already championing women photography. And then, as you can see from her self-portrait, she self-styled herself as a kind of a new woman. This picture of her in 1896, she's showing off her ankles, you know, slightly scandalous. She's holding a beer stein and she's smoking. All things that proper ladies didn't do. She also has her own work in the background on the mantelpiece. And then we also know that, you know, around 1913, she actually moved to New York and she opened up an architectural studio with another woman, Maddie Hewitt Edwards, who was her romantic partner, the only one we sort of know of in her life. But starting in the late 1920s, she started photographing architecture in Virginia. And remember, she's sort of from this area. And sorry, here's some of the pictures she made at Hampton School. I forgot about this. And over the course of more than 20 years, she made something like 9,000 photographs, first in Virginia and then throughout the South, documenting historic photography, historic architecture. She managed to get the Carnegie Corporation to support her in this endeavor. And as she began photographing older buildings, some of which were the earliest examples of colonial architecture, she also convinced the Library of Congress to begin collecting photographs. I mean, she's a groundbreaker in many ways, but she wrote to the Library of Congress and she sent them a bunch of pictures and some negatives. And then she said, I think you should start collecting photographs. I think it would be an important thing for the library to collect. And, you know, now the library has something like 2 million photographs. So anyway, we can thank her for a lot, but we can also thank her for the work that she left the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Now, this was a really interesting period of, in Virginia history, a real interest in historic preservation, particularly the colonial past. And in order to make these pictures, Johnston, you know, there were some guidebooks being written, but she actually had to travel all around the country using, you know, sort of old maps, word of mouth, and she would sort of do anything to get a picture. And I want to go back too, because I also want to say that she did not do this alone. And one of the stories that has yet to be written, and maybe at some point I'll have some time to do this, is the fact that she spent, you know, more than 10 years driving around the South with Huntley Ruff, who is the man you see kind of on the left, African-American gentleman. And he was her driver, but really her assistant. And together, the two of them, you know, traveled throughout the South, making, you know, pictures everywhere. By this point, Johnston was in her 60s. And there are descriptions of, you know, her wanting to have, you know, like vines removed from a building or lying down on her back to get a picture of the ceiling. I mean, she would do anything to get a picture. And Huntley Ruff, you know, obviously assisted her with a lot of that. One of the questions I sort of have about this is, you know, what was it like for them to travel together through the South at this moment? You know, where did he stay? You know, was she staying in segregated places? So I think it brings up a lot of interesting questions. And I've not been able to find a lot about him yet, but I would like to. Anyway, so here are a couple more pictures by Johnston that are really the founding kind of collection in our museum. Now, when this was first shown, it was kind of seen as an appropriate subject for the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts because it was about Virginia. These are about sort of historic and colonial architecture in Virginia. And in fact, the director, Thomas Colt, in the press release for the show in 1936, sort of wrote about it as substitutes for architecture. He says, the Virginia Museum wishes extravagantly that it were possible to move them, meaning these buildings, bodily within the protection of its own walls. Failing in this manifest impossibility, Miss Johnston's photographs present an excellent alternative. But that being said, a lot of critics who saw these pictures really remarked on them, not just for their subject matter, but actually as examples of incredible photographs. One critic praised it, saying, "Each picture has its own story, its history, and its particular artistic contribution. Light and shadows play across the materials of her subjects. The bricks seem to sing." And then another critic said that she not only has good technique, but, quote, "the eye of an artist who knows, as few do, the rules of composition and the magic in light and shade. Her prints are three-dimensional. One can walk into them. And even the oldest embarrassed house is beautified by caressing sunshine and kindly shade." So you can see that there's not only a maker who's really interested in the aesthetics of photography, but there is a receptive, critical public looking at this work. The other thing I want to say too is that Johnston was hired to photograph historic architecture, but she took that to mean not just the famous buildings, but also she photographed barns, she photographed former, quarters of formerly enslaved people, she photographed mills, and she was as interested in the examples of vernacular architecture as she was in kind of, the more grand buildings. And, these pictures remain a really important kind of touchstone, not only for the history of photography, but also the history of architecture in Virginia. So here we are, 1936, the museum opens. We've got these two great photography shows. And in fact, Johnston's show goes on to circulate throughout Virginia. This is the beginning also of the museum lending art to other smaller museums or other establishments throughout the Commonwealth. And this is something, as an aside, we still do. We have more than 1,000 partners in the Commonwealth, and we share the resources of the collection as much as possible. So that being said, this is the first chapter of photography in the museum. However, aside from the Johnston works, which funds were donated to acquire by the Carnegie Corporation, and the works that came in from the either the Camera Club shows or the Virginia Photographic Salons, there was no other attempt to build a photography collection in the early years. But this started to change around 1950. And now we get to, oops, here you see a few more Johnstons. I love these pictures. We get to the second chapter, which is the question, is photography fine art? I'm just going to let my dog out of my office because she's whining. I'll be right back. Out. Oh. Sorry, everybody, animals. So in 1950, our next chapter begins, and it begins with the beginning of traveling exhibitions coming to the museum. So until this time, from 1936 to 1950, it is the Virginia Photographic Salons and the Johnston Show, but nothing else. And starting in 1950, the museum begins to take photography shows. And the first one they do is by Clarence John Laughlin. And it's essentially based on his book, Ghosts Along the Mississippi, which sort of in a weird way mirrors Johnston's work. This is a project he did photographing the plantation houses of Louisiana, which he published in 1948. And there are kind of these views onto these crumbling antebellum mansions. It's sort of almost like a pictorial equivalent to Poe's Fall of the House of Usher. But Laughlin is a very inventive photographer as well. He's using double exposures, you can see here, and interesting ways of printing. And the work really is about kind of the Southern heritage. So this show occurred in 1950 at the museum, but nothing was acquired for the museum. And then this kind of continues. So in 1953, the museum shows the work of George Cook, and then actually his son, Eustace Cook. Now, George Cook was a Virginia photographer, Richmond photographer, who began photographing during the Civil War. And he established a studio. I think he was originally from South Carolina, but established a studio in Richmond, which then continued under his sons, and produced an incredible documentation sort of after the war through the 1920s, 30s, 40s. And this exhibition, which was called Southern Exposure, happened at the museum in 1953. And there was a huge amount of press at the time for it because there was this rediscovered cache of negatives. I'm showing you a kind of digitization of one of those negatives there, one of my favorite pictures. And the show was a real success. They even set up a little photo studio in the museum where you could have an instant daguerreotype made, because it was 1953. They had an early Polaroid photograph. I always think that these kind of participatory museum activities are a product of now, but it's funny to think that back in 1953 you had the same thing. But once again, this didn't result in any acquisitions. And in fact, the Cook collection is housed at the Valentine. And we just acquired our first George Cook this past year because a lovely donor I know gave us one. So then the next interesting moment in the history is when the Virginia Museum hosts the Family of Man exhibit in 1956. Now, this is probably one of the most famous photography exhibitions in the history of the medium, I guess. And it included 503 pictures by 273 artists from 68 countries. And it was organized by Edward Siskind, the famous photographer, who was also the sort of director of photography at the Museum of Modern Art, New York. And the exhibit was very much of a kind of post-war humanist take on like the look of life, sort of a study of life from birth to death through this global lens. The exhibition toured the world for 8 years, attracted more than 9 million visitors, but Richmond was one of its early stops. And what was so interesting to me, looking at the reviews of this show in Virginia, is how much people talked about the design of the show. And as you can see here from this photograph and from here, it was a very different kind of presentation. Instead of framed photographs on the wall like paintings, the designer at VMFA tried to mimic the very radical designs at MoMA and do their own thing with these kind of montages and these hanging pictures. So really, we have a sense that everything is up to date in Richmond in 1956. But once again, it didn't really result in any formation of a photography department. Nothing from this exhibition was acquired. It was kind of more that these were passing through. But I do think it really primed the pump for thinking about photography as more of a art form at the museum. And certainly looking beyond that kind of local, the South or the Camera Club, to understand photography as really a modern form of communication. And this sort of first takes place in 1959. Oh, there's another view. Which is with the beginning of something called the Photography and the Fine Arts. And the first exhibition in 1959 at VMFA is called "Is Photography an Art?" ? And this was one of these traveling exhibitions organized by this entity called Photography and the Fine Arts, which was the brainchild of one guy named Ivan Dmitri. He was an artist who also went by the name Levon West, who had done a lot of illustration work with the Saturday Review. So it was under his illustration work, he was Levon West, but as a photographer and champion of photography, he went by Ivan Dmitri. To make a long and somewhat circuitous story, a little bit shorter, Dmitry launched what essentially became this national endeavor to promote photography as a fine art in the museum world. So working with the Metropolitan Museum of Art, he put together a jury, which included a number of museum directors, among them Leslie Cheek, the director of the VMFA at the time. And this was a very savvy move on his part, because I think he understood that at heart, most museum directors actually just want to be curators. So he gets together these museum directors on a jury, and he invites them to essentially curate a show every single year. And then these shows would travel around the country. The museum directors also got to curate the 1965 Kodak exhibit at the World's Fair. But this is really also a real interesting look at contemporary photography, because the artists that they selected included Irving Penn, Richard Avedon, Gordon Parks, Dorothea Lange, Roy DeCrava, Walker Evans. All of these were major artists, none of whom were in the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts collection. So this was really the first time that kind of contemporary photography was being discussed seriously at the level of the museum director. The museum hosted a symposium, which was titled "Is Photography an Art?" And the answers were, according to the art critic Hilton Kramer, definitely not. According to Yvonne Dmitry, definitely was. And Hyatt Mayer, who's the curator of prints and drawings at the Met, was, it depends. But I think what's kind of key here to take away is that this is really the first moment that the museum gets involved with the larger kind of debates around photography as a fine art. And this is also when it starts to collect art, photography as an art form. And this was thanks to Leslie Cheek, who is, one of the figures you see in that round table reviewing selections of photographs for the 5th exhibition, which was shown at the museum. Now, I don't necessarily agree with all of Cheek's tastes. The photograph on the left and right are by the same person, Art Kane. The one on the right was the cover of the catalog. The one on the left is the one that he selected for our museum. To me, it's a little maudlin. That being said, he did really usher in a new era for photography collecting. Not only, bringing in works from these exhibitions, and we have some works that were shown in that show that came to us, but also for the very first time using funds to buy works of art. You see here, John Barton Payne Fund. This is the very first photograph that was acquired with museum funding for the museum. Sometimes things were given, or in the case of the Johnston, they were purchased by another entity and then given to the museum. So we see this, interest in 1965. And in fact, there was a show, Leslie Cheek actually bought a bunch of photographs himself and gave to the museum. So in 1965, there is this show, and we see the important photographers of the moment. So it seems like this is the beginning of the photography collection, once again, at the VMFA. But after the show in 1965, Cheek retires in 1968, and nothing happens between 1966, which is when the last picture he buys comes in, and until 1973. There's no photography that is acquired or shown. And then in 1963, we have 73, we have the very next chapter, once again, the beginning of photography, part 3 or 4 at the museum. And this now brings in a character that some of you may know. I've heard a lot about him, but I never had the opportunity to meet him. But in this moment, the museum hires or gives George Kruger, who was not the official photography curator, but the unofficial photography curator. He was officially, I think, the publications manager, kind of gives him a little bit of latitude to form a photography collection. And so starting in 1973, he goes out and kind of sets out to build a real collection, not just sort of buy things here and there. And this is an interesting moment, because this is exactly the same time that a number of other museums in the United States that didn't start collecting in the 1930s began collecting. And this would include the MFA Houston, the Minneapolis Museum of Art, the Getty in the 1980s, the LA County Museum of Art. This also coincided with the rise of a number of photography education programs, as well as the rise of photography galleries as the beginning of kind of the photography art market. So George Kruger was aware of all this and really trying to get the VMFA up to speed. In his first year alone, Kruger acquired 84 pictures, and these still are among our most important works of art. And he was very systematic. He kind of started with the 19th century. You see here William Henry Fox Talbot from 1844, one of the earliest photographs that was published. But he also, kind of tried to cover the whole history of photography. And, from everything from the Man Ray that you see on the left, which is probably the one he spent the most on at the time, but it was something like $800 rather than $100. But he bought contemporary photographs. In his second year of collecting in 1974, he bought more than 15 photographs by Lee Friedlander. This is really contemporary, also acquiring work by Ray Metzger. So he's really interested in both the history of photography as well as the present. And he had a real understanding of the medium. In order to acquire these too, he wasn't traveling around so much. He would write to galleries, he would write to artists, he would write to artists' estates. And he would sometimes say, like, I would like to buy a print of this, which is reproduced on page 34 of this book. In the case of this August Sonder, we have the correspondence, from the Sonder family. And they wrote back and they said, well, you can have a new print of it for $100, or you can have an old print of it for $400, meaning one that Sonder made at the time that he made the negative. And fortunately, Kruger decided that they would spend the $400 on the so-called vintage print. Nowadays, the difference between a new print and a vintage print for an August Sonder is something like, 500 times more expensive. So anyway, thank you, George Kruger. But he did not have, full support. He had about $8,000 over a couple of years, and he bought several hundred photographs. And this also led, I think, to some of the first real gifts to the museum. I think the family of Gertrude Pacebier was so pleased that he bought this photogravure for something like $100, that they went and gave 13 more pictures by Pacebier. So we have a really lovely collection of this early 20th century artist. And he was, tried to cover the field with his limited resources. There was Steichen's early work on the left, French 19th century critically important photographer on the right, Gustave Legray. But in many cases, he could only afford one. So it was kind of a sample collection. He acquired work by Julia Margaret Cameron. He was attentive to sort of, diversity in the photography field as much as he could. And he collected really contemporary work. Arbus was making these prints in the late 60s and early 70s, and he was acquiring them just a few years later. So he definitely had his pulse on things. And he acquired the first work by a Black photographer in the museum, the Roy de Carava you see on the left, as well as the first, photograph by a Japanese photographer on the right. Now, he couldn't do everything. And I should say, he was thinking about photography in a global sense, mostly American and European, but he also did not ignore the local. And the other ways that photography started coming into the collection in these years was that the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts fellowships were being given to photographers as well as, painters and printmakers. So Emmett Gowan had VMFA fellowships, and some of his early work, is in the museum. Now, Kruger was not able to get everything he wanted. And this was a letter I found in the archive, which is sort of heartbreaking. He had tried to get in touch with Robert Frank to buy some work from Robert Frank's very important 1955 project, The Americans, but he couldn't find them anywhere. And at this point, Frank was no longer interested really in print photography. He was working on film. So we have this letter where Kruger is hoping to get a print, and he never did. And it remains today to be a major lapse in our collection. We have one minor Robert Frank that is not, from this period. But to see this tells me that he knew what the museum needed. He just didn't necessarily have all the funds and support. So Kruger sort of has a couple of years where he gets to buy a lot, and he continues to curate great shows. But he's not ever officially a photography curator. He has another full-time job, and he doesn't really have the support. And that really would continue until I got hired in one sense. But on the other hand, starting about 25 years ago, we see a new shift in the museum's interest in photography. And this really begins in the sort of mid-1990s, and it comes mostly from the curators in modern and contemporary art. And this is because this is the moment also where a lot of contemporary photography is seen not just as photography, but seen as fine arts. You have photography being sold in the modern and contemporary auctions and the day sales, and not sort of segregated into the photography world. So the museum acquires this work by Sugimoto. This is a project that this photographer made of movie houses throughout the world. And what he's doing, of course, is he's leaving the shutter open during the entire movie. It's just available light. So all that comes across in the final photograph is a blank screen, but in fact, the film has recorded the entire movie. So it's sort of this moment of conceptual photography coming into the museum. Similarly, a very important early work by Carrie Mae Weems, one of the most kind of important photographers working today. But these were seen as works of contemporary art and not necessarily as building up a photography collection. And that really begins to change in recent years, thanks, primarily to a lot of my colleagues in modern and contemporary art who are very interested. There was also been a renewed attention to kind of photography in the region, right? It's not an exclusive focus. It's not either we look at the South or we look at, contemporary photography everywhere. So we've been acquiring the work of Richmond's Willie Ann Wright for a long time. And in fact, this past December, we just acquired her archives for the museum, as well as about 250 works by her, paintings and mostly photographs. We've been building up a really strong collection of Sally Mann and plan to continue to bring more of that in. But we also started to build out our holdings of FSA photography, of civil rights photography, things focused on Virginia or more broadly the region. In 2015, a little bit earlier, 2013, my colleague in modern contemporary art, Sarah Eckhart, started working with the family of Louis Draper, who's from Richmond, as the founder of the Camoinga Photography Collective, which was based in New York, but he's from Richmond. Which is the sort of collaborative collective of Black photographers. And those archives have come to the museum, and a really important body of work. I'm sure many of you saw the exhibition that was on view in 2020 here. It went on a little pause during COVID, but it has been traveling around the country and has brought a lot of new attention to the VMFA as the site and center for photography. Ming Smith is one of the members of the Camoinga, and that has been a huge boost to our collection. More recently, photography was part of the Dirty South exhibit. And then since I've come on board a little more than a year ago, we've been adding very quickly to the collection. Carrie Mae Weems, who I mentioned before, her kitchen table series was one of my first big projects. It's one of the kind of most important photographic projects of the sort of late 20th century. So I was really excited to bring it here. And then, of course, my own title, the Aaron Siskind Curator of Photography, is thanks to the Siskind Foundation, which in 2019 began to sort of think about its future and decided to transfer the holdings of the foundation to the VMFA. So we have about 4,000 Siskind photographs, kind of covering his whole career, which we're in the process of digitizing. And then we are stewards for another 4,000 photographs, which are duplicates, which we will be distributing to other institutions around the country and frankly around the world. And that's really exciting because, you know, as somebody representing a collection that is in some ways very fledgling, in other ways is not, as I've been trying to say, it's really amazing to be on the other side of you know, we're definitely trying to build up our collection, but to also be able to be an ambassador and to be able to give works of art to other institutions is really exciting. Some of the things I've been interested in is also building up our holdings of 19th century photography too. We'll never have an amazing collection, but it is really important. I mean, Virginia was kind of the center of Civil War photography. This is a daguerreotype that's currently up in a collection we have up now of daguerreotypes of African-American subjects or by African-American makers. This is by J.P. Ball, who was born free in Frederick County, Virginia, became a daguerreotypist in the 1840s. And, you know, is one of the first Black daguerreotypists. So to me, this is an important kind of direction for us to go in. But also, I'm really trying to build out our collection more broadly and looking at some of the big holes we have. For example, we had no work by Helen Levitt, and now we have 2 works by her, which we just acquired in the last couple months. And I've also been really fortunate in that I'm able to acquire work with funds. The work on the right by An Mi Lê is sort of a wonderful complement to some of our Virginia history. This is a Vietnamese American artist who actually emigrated to the United States from Vietnam when she was a teenager. And one of her projects that she did was really thinking about, she thinks a lot about kind of military history and how it's shaped culture. And she stumbled across Vietnam War reenactors. I think we all know about Civil War reenactors, but she was surprised to find that there are actually Vietnam War reenactors in Virginia. And she wanted to photograph these reenactments, and the reenactors agreed as long as she would also participate as a character. So she often played either a collaborator or a member of the Viet Cong in their reenactments, but then she also got to photograph them. So that's what you see on the right. So it's a kind of contemporary work. It's a somewhat conceptual work, but it also relates to this country's history, and it's rooted in Virginia. And the work on the left is part of a major gift we just got from some collectors in Washington. It's mostly environmental photography, really kind of from Ansel Adams through the 1990s, a lot of amazing landscape. And that's, one of the things that I'm really interested in doing is the more we show photography and the more we educate people about what we have in our collection, the more that we can build our collection and really contribute, kind of to the discourse of photography. And what I'll say, my last thing in closing is that I'm sure those of you who've been to the museum know that our photography gallery is really currently a hallway between the restaurant and the bathroom, which is not bad because you get a lot of foot traffic, but it really doesn't accommodate a large presentation. Part of my job in the coming years is to plan a suite of about 5,500 square foot photography galleries, so really major galleries that will be adjacent to what we're calling the Raysor Center for Works on Paper, which will be a publicly accessible study room, as well as conservation labs and matting and framing and proper storage for photography, cool and cold storage. So the study room will be able to accommodate groups of visitors, people who want to come see our collection if it's not on the walls. And then, of course, the galleries will be able to present, big exhibitions of photography at least twice a year. And we're also midway through a major digitization project so that we can get all of our collection online. So people can see what we have online and then come into the museum and see the prints in person. We can give classes in the study room. We can welcome groups like the Camera Club for, focused visits. So, overall, the goal is to really increase the presence and visibility of photography at the museum, but also be more of a linchpin for different communities interested in photography in the region. So that's where I'm going to stop my talk. And now I am happy to answer any questions or just listen to comments or criticisms or anything.
Well, Sarah, I guess I will speak first and just thank you very, very much. Amazing history. I didn't know all of that at all. I look forward to coming and seeing a lot more. And of course, being part of the Camera Club, I know we're excited about being part of VMFA as you start to build and explore. So,
Yeah.
thank you. That was phenomenal.
At some point, we hope to do a little Camera Club installation and show work from those first, 10 or 15 years. A lot of those names are lost to history, but it's kind of fun to see, what was happening then.
That's great.
I think I see Jay has his hand up.
Thank you for a very nice presentation. Did Frances Johnston, I hope I got her name right, did she leave any forms of diaries or memoirs or anything that you might be able to see what she did and what she was doing? She's a pretty interesting character.
Yeah, so there's been a couple different studies of her. I believe that there's a lot of archival material at the Library of Congress. I haven't been there to see it. They have her glass negatives, many of her glass negatives. There are a couple different institutions, and I think they have a lot of her correspondence as well. But I have not seen any reference to, there hasn't been like a full length exhibition. There was a biography done maybe 20 or 30 years ago. She's really ripe for study. I think she kind of was almost way ahead of her time. She was one of those figures. I don't know if you're familiar with, sort of during the pandemic, the New York Times started doing these little biographies of, people we should have paid attention to, a long time ago. And they did one of her, which was wonderful, but it pointed out that there still really isn't a whole lot of research on her.
You have a question in the chat. Actually, there are a couple of questions coming up. Let's see, one was from Linda to ask you when you expect this new photography gallery to open.
Well, we don't exactly know the sequence of events because the photography gallery is part of the larger expansion of the museum. The museum is building a new wing, and the photography will actually not be in the new wing. It will be where the American art galleries are now. So if you're familiar with the museum, kind of a newer part of the museum on the second floor, it's actually a fantastic space. I'm very happy about that. I think at this point, the target date is 2026, but with construction projects, I just take it all with a grain of salt. So we will continue to do the small installations. I will say that I am co-curating an exhibition on the history of photography in the South that will be on view at the museum in 2024, and that will include a fair number of works from our collection. And that will be a bigger show. I do see, I'm looking at the chat now, and I see a question about whether the collections can be visited if not on display. And they can be with advance notice. We have a small reading room right now, which kind of doubles as, you know, like the depot for things and some cataloging projects. But we do accommodate visitors who want to see things. We accommodate classrooms. We're not fully staffed in the way that we will be when we open up our study center and supposedly 26, where we will really have like, it'll be like a library in which there will be somebody working there full time. We'll pull works, we'll have stands. But if there are things that people want to see, we can definitely do that. And we work a lot with the local universities to show things to classes. So people can just get in touch with me if they are interested in that.
Pardon me. Thank you for a very fine presentation. Is there an updated photography catalog for the VMFA?
We don't have a catalog that's been published, and our collection is growing so quickly. Like I think something like 600 or 700 works came in just in December. But what we are trying to do is to get everything digitized and updated on our website. And the digitization is going pretty well. We got a grant for that. And I would say about 80% of our collection is digitized. Our website has other issues. So getting it actually onto the website has been more of the challenge. And that is in part because our website is part of the state of Virginia. We don't, that's outside of my pay grade. But that is the best way to search what we have. It's just unfortunately at the moment a kind of clunky way to search what we have.
Thank you kindly.
Sure.
I'll just add a couple of tidbits to the history that Dr. Kennel was talking about. CCR was actually organized in 1932. She said 31 or 32. And we are a charter member of the Photographic Society of America. And also we are preserving some of the founders' names in our end of year awards. So if any of you were at our banquet in December, you might have noticed that there was an Edwin Booth Award, and that goes each year to the best black and white print. And that was one of the names that I noticed that she keyed on. So we're trying to keep that history alive within the club as well.
That's great. I mean, I've been very interested in the role of camera clubs, and you know, we have this history of photography, which is written, you know, either as like a kind of technological history of inventions or as sort of great artists. But in fact, so much of photography happened outside of those areas. So it's an interesting subject, but it's nice to have that continued connection with the club.
Any other questions?
Oh, sure, I have one. Sarah, as director of exhibitions for the club, I want to know, when are we going to get our first exhibit at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts?
Well, we'll see. Maybe when we do the history of the camera club at VMFA, we'll do the present moment as well. So
thank you for even thinking about it.
absolutely, it'd be great to collaborate on something.
That is a think about that could also bring in a lot more members.
Yeah.
All right, I see a raised hand from Frank.
Thank you very much for a fantastic presentation, Dr. Kennel. I have a question. Is there any chance that VMFA will form a relationship with Virginia Sally Mann?
Yes, I think there's a good chance of that. So she's I've worked very closely with her in the past, and so we are definitely eager that she would that her archives and a major collection would come to the museum, which is, I think, the right place for it. So that's an ongoing conversation, so stay tuned.
It's a very interesting presentation. Learned a lot about kind of a different angle than we normally have as history going back, and those old photographs are wonderful. And I like those blue tinted photographs from way back. They were quite fine for the way back.
Yeah, those are amazing. And I feel like, you know, it's an artist we don't know anything about, except that she was part of this camera club and she's a woman, and they're incredible. And that's what I actually really love about the history of photography, is that there's so much we don't know and there's so much to kind of discover. So yeah, it's wonderful.
How do you feel about AI right now? Artificial intelligence in photography?
I don't know. I mean, I think that I take the long view, which is that throughout the history of the medium, there's always been anxieties about automation of some sort or another, right? You know, whether it was the snapshot camera and everybody suddenly being able to make a picture, or whether it's Photoshop and that's the end of art, or, you know. So to me, on the one hand, it's part of the longer history of the medium, which has always been kind of caught between, is it an art? Is it a science? You know, is it a tool? So I don't think too much about it. I will also say, though, that I prefer not to think too much about it.
Right answer.
Yeah.
Actually, the part of the presentation which unfortunately failed was about the attempt to create the picture using artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And well, I have to, right now I can only say that in words. I did it. I asked artificial intelligence chatbot to create a description for the abstract image. After that, I sent it to another artificial intelligence engine. It created that picture. And I wish I could show that to the club. But I was pretty much puzzled, because it does erase the borders between where the human and where is the machine, and what is actually which part is belong to human and remains the human being, and what is the machine work. Yes, we've been struggling with Photoshop, with replacing skies, with changing the, removing the objects from, or adding objects, or doing juxtaposition in the images. That was also kind of the stumbling point, and we have some rules in our during our evaluation that the image should not be essentially re-engineered, if I can say that word, about the piece of art. Now we have yet another dimension, which for some I hear even scary. The artist already complaining that the artwork produced by artificial intelligence wins prizes on some competition. So what I've heard also, that those who make and design artificial intelligence engines will produce some kind of way to identify that as such. So we probably will have chance to see whether it's 100% human, 50% human, or maybe 5% human. Don't know whether that scale is actually doing any good, but at least we will know. And as you said, well, we do our photographic work, and well, what happens will happen. We'll see that. in the future will show.
And then when they show the person who took the picture, you're going to have to figure out if that person is a human or not.
Yeah, it's very complicated. I mean, I think it will push some kind of making in a different direction. I mean, the other thing, of course, is that the training sets that are used to train the algorithms to create images are not made by other machines. So you have a kind of culturally constructed, technologically driven, medium. And early AI was pretty faulty because the training sets themselves were faulty. I mean, we sort of know this about biases in AI that are really the biases of the humans that are kind of feeding them images and data. And I guess the question is how that evolves. I don't know.
Well, you're absolutely right. Right now, the artificial intelligence is essentially training neural network.
Yeah.
And as such, it reflects the trainers' minds. And right now, we have trainers everywhere because as these chatbots and artificial intelligence agents open to the general public, and so far it's free or with negligent price, then these agents become even trained in progressive scale, exponentially greater and faster. So it's all our collective effort. So at certain point, these engines will reflect the opinion of the those who contributed, and those are millions of people. When the artificial intelligence, and if artificial intelligence becomes sentient, at that point, it will go its own way without us. And that's another scary moment.
Yeah, by then I won't be worrying about the history of photography though.
Maybe
I
a nano.
think I see Frank's hand, or maybe that was from the earlier question. Did you have another question, Frank? No, maybe not. Anything else?
On, Frank.
All right. Well, Dr. Kennel, we certainly thank you for being with us tonight for a fabulous presentation. We enjoyed that so much, and we wish you all success in your new position. Can't wait to see things up on the walls there.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to meet you, at least virtually. And thanks for accommodating the Zoom talk. And I hope to meet some of you in the flesh.
Hopefully everybody could turn their cameras on so she could see what you look like.
Thank you. Very good. Wonderful,
you so
wonderful,
much.
wonderful.
All right. Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a wonderful night.
All
Same
right.
to you.
We will
Thank you very much.
see you guys next month, same
Next
time,
month.
same place.
And for those who still online, I accept my apology for the technical glitch. I promise to make another attempt next month, and I will show my attempt to shake hand with artificial intelligence.
And Leo, we can put that out on our Facebook group.
But Leo,
yes.
by next month, there'll be the next